Welcome back. Now we're going to focus specifically on the Republic because this is the period that is most relevant for our two Roman playwrights, Plautus and Terence. So as you saw in the video that introduced Roman history, the Roman Republic is considered officially to have lasted from 510 BC down to 31 BC. 510 BC marks the termination of the king period with the fall of the seventh king of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus, and 31 BC marks what's considered the really effective end of the Roman Republic with the Battle of Actium, in which the adopted son of Caesar, Octavian, conquers his erstwhile fellow triumvir, Mark Antony. Mark Antony flees to Egypt and in fact will die of suicide the following year, 30 BC. So with the elimination of Mark Antony, Octavian emerges as the sole ruler of Rome, and his position as sole ruler transforms the Roman state sufficiently to eventually see the termination of the Republic. Now, for our purposes, and especially for the purpose of Roman comedy, there are three basic periods of the Republic, essentially sub-periods under the Republic, that have to do with where Rome existed militarily in relation to the world outside. Because where Rome stood militarily has a profound effect on what type of literature Rome itself was capable of creating, what influences Rome could derive from literature from other peoples. So initially, in the first period of, as I've set it up here, of the Roman Republic, which we could call the early Roman Republic, lasting from 510 BC down to 272 BC. Roman influence is almost entirely restricted to the country of Italy itself. So if you take a look at your map of Italy, you will see, which you can find under resources, you can see the different cities and the different territories inside Italy, all of which will eventually fall under Roman influence. But you'll notice that it takes quite a while to get there. From 510 BC, it takes over 2 centuries before the Romans are finally able to subdue all of Italy. It appears in the early days that the Romans relied much more on alliance than outright conquest. But gradually, as the Romans spread out from their city on the Tiber River, the west coast of Italy, away, they first bumped into the Etruscans to their north, and then gradually worked their way east, southeast, and eventually north, where they were able to even get up into what was then called Gaul, which is now France, and then finally were able to make their way down into the southern part of Italy, where Greek colonies could be found. So this whole stretch took the Romans, as we say, over two centuries to secure. The final chapter in the Italic conquest comes in 272 BC with the fall of the last holdout city down in southern Italy called Tarentum. Today it's Taranto. And with the fall of Tarentum, the Romans finally had complete control over all of Italy. In this period, any literature the Romans would have produced, which incidentally is not considered part of Roman literature the way we think of it today, would have been based pretty much on models of the Italic countryside around them, Oscans, Umbrians, and other peoples nearby. There were some meteors that could be used. But from what we could tell, there wasn't any specific Roman literature that we can point to that say this is at the beginning of Roman literature. Instead, there's a very clear cut that even the Romans themselves established for when their Roman literature is considered to have begun. So prior models are obviously there, but there isn't really much written record to go on. In a way, that makes it difficult for us because it means that we don't have very good established recorded documentation from early literature to be able to guide our way. One thing that, however, is on writing from this period that I mentioned in the previous video is the 12 tables. We do have those documents surviving, and they are the first existence of Roman written law that we have, coming from 450 BC and lasting for quite a long time in Roman society. Later laws eventually became more prevalent in their authority. So the 12 tables eventually receded to the background, but they were always there and could always be referred to as the basis of Roman law as needed, and also are among our earliest examples of Roman writing and Roman inscription that we have surviving. However, Roman literature, as we think of it, comes from the next period. After the Romans secured Italy, they ran into difficulties with their rival down to their south, Carthage. If you look on your map, you'll see that you have Italy itself, which is the main part of the map, but then not too far away from Italy, further south, you can also look on the pink map of the empire to see this. You will see that Africa has the Gulf of Libya, but then it curves up before continuing on west to form where Algeria is. And that area where it curves up is today the country of Tunisia. But originally, where the city of Tunis is today, was the very powerful city of Carthage. This city was quite an old one that predated Rome by a few centuries. It was founded originally by Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians come from today where Israel is, where Canaan originally was. The Phoenicians were seafarers, among the best of their time, and founded a number of important colonies all through the Mediterranean, including Carthage. And one other very important one you should know about is Massalia, which is in southeast Gaul, which eventually became the city of Marseille today in southeast France. So Carthage was an influential city in its area and had possessions all around its own area in North Africa, plus also importantly up in Sicily. There already had been some difficulties with Carthage in Sicily, in that case related to Greece, because Greeks and Carthaginians previously had sparred over territorial possession in Sicily, and quite famously in 480 BC, the same year as the probably better known Battle of Salamis in the Persian Wars in Greece, 480 BC was the Battle of Himera, which was a major conflict between Carthaginians and Greeks there in Sicily. So there was a long history of difficulties between Carthaginians and other either locals or outsiders trying to have possessions in Sicily. It was a hotspot militarily. So the Romans ran into conflict also with Carthaginians on Sicily, and that's what started what would turn out to be just slightly over a century of a series of 3 wars called the Punic Wars against Carthage. They are called Punic Wars because the word Punic refers to Phoenician because of the Carthaginians' original origin from the Phoenician people. So the Carthaginians held off the Romans as well as they could for that century and a quarter, and even ended up invading Italy and almost got down to Rome under the leadership of Hannibal, who famously took a whole army of men and elephants across the Alps and were able to vanquish Roman armies one after another down in Italy itself, including very famously at Cannae in 216 BC. So the Carthaginians were in fact a formidable opponent for the Romans, and the Romans really had a very hard time controlling them. Eventually, however, the Romans were able to subdue the Carthaginians by first chasing Hannibal all around Italy and refusing ever to engage in battle with him, and then finally counterattacking against Carthage directly in their home territory. The person whose family is responsible in part for the sponsorship of Terence, ironically himself an author who came from Carthage, was Scipio Africanus. He was the hero of the Second Punic War, who conquered Carthage by defeating them in the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. Scipio's later descendant, Scipio Aemilianus, was the one who finally finished off Carthage completely in the termination of the Third Punic War in 146 BC, and that's when Carthage was razed to the ground. Now, the conquest of Carthage, of course, was an enormous transformation of Roman power. including their military expansion, clearly. The move into Sicily and then eventually into Carthage in North Africa was really effectively the first major step that the Romans took outside of Italy. Once they did so, however, other parts of the Mediterranean world around them began coming to them in pretty rapid succession. They eventually got up into Gaul, they got over into Spain, they managed to get the rest of North Africa, and very importantly for our purposes, they got over to Egypt and to Macedonia, to Greece, and eventually even further east. So the territory that had been secured by Alexander the Great away from the Persians, now the Romans were able to go out and take it away from Greeks and Parthians and the other peoples out in that area. Now, however, what started all that? That's what brings us to here. And this is, in fact, quite important for understanding how Roman literature develops in general, and specifically how Roman comedy develops. Because when the Romans conquered Carthage, as we said, they got themselves outside their boxed environment of Italy, which meant that now they could get much more in touch with outside civilization, outside the four walls of Italy, so to speak. Now, remember that this is in the Hellenistic period in the ancient Greek world. Remember, this is the time period after the death of Alexander the Great. Now, in that period, there was a lot of commerce, trade, intellectual ideas exchanged all through the Mediterranean world. One of the chief areas for this was Alexandria in Egypt. Another one was Pergamum up in Northwest Asia Minor. But there were lots and lots of places where this type of exchange of ideas and goods and so forth was going on. So it happened that the Romans showed up on the scene at a really opportune moment, because as they came much more in contact with outsiders, they began to become aware that there was a lot to learn out there about, for instance, how literature could be composed, how art could be made, how architecture could be built, and so forth. So the Romans had some idea of how to do it from the early Republican days, but now all of a sudden they had a whole new set of models and potential discoveries that they could find out there. So the reason why the Romans got into contact with these two places is that, unluckily for them, Philip of Macedon, this is now Philip V, not Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great. Philip V of Macedon, who was very ambitious about expanding Macedonian power, allied with Hannibal in 215 BC, when Hannibal was in the process of invading Italy. That was because of prior conflicts between the Romans and Macedonians having to do with Illyria in the decades before that. Of course, it was impossible to know that at the time, but that would eventually turn out to be a fatal mistake on the part of Philip, because the Romans were aware of this and they never lost sight of what should happen to the Macedonians as a result of their allying with their greatest enemy ever, Hannibal. So when the Romans concluded the Second Punic War, 201 BC, they turned on Macedonia. Macedonia held out for about another 40 years. They were defeated twice in two separate Macedonian wars, first in 197 BC and then later in 168 BC. And then there was one final war where the Macedonians at last were really worked out, and that one concluded in 148 BC. At that time, the Macedonians had gotten a lot of support from southern Greeks who opposed Roman influence as it was spreading. And the Greeks at that time, when the Macedonia fell, also rebelled themselves. And so that drew the Romans finally down into Greece. And finally, in 146 BC, the same year as the fall of Carthage, the Romans defeated the Achaean League, which was run by the city of Corinth, by destroying that city. And as a result, the Romans in the same year were able to secure Carthage, and with it soon after North Africa, and Macedonia, and Greece altogether. Because of that, the Romans now had an abundant influence from literature of many different types that they had never seen before when they were confined primarily to Italy. It's in this time period that the Romans become much more aware of Greek New Comedy. You'll notice that this is a little bit after the period of Menander, so Greek New Comedy was pretty well established by then, and the Romans picked up on it and started to produce it themselves. So in later videos, we're going to talk about how Roman literature itself developed and who were some of the well-known and successful Roman authors in the early days of Roman literature, getting the Roman literary forms started. Thank you, and we will see you next video.